Hello everybody and welcome to a new video on the Mirrorless channel. I'm your host Matt, and today we're going to talk about 4 portrait lenses for the Fujifilm X mount system, 3 made by Fujifilm and 1 made by Viltrox. So let's have a look at the lenses. Here they are. So we have the 50mm f1.0, this is a recent addition and also the first autofocus lens with such a fast aperture of 1.0. This is the 56 1.2, it is the oldest lens in this comparison, it was released in 2014. The Viltrox 56mm 1.4 is also a recent addition. And then we have the 50mm f2, which is, as you can see, the smallest lens here. And I tested all the lenses with the Fujifilm X-T4 and the latest firmware available at the time of publishing this comparison. So let's have a look at things they have in common. So first of all, they all have a metal build, and they all have plastic hoods except the Viltrox, which has a metal hood and there's a little bit of plastic ring here when you attach it. 2 of them are weather sealed. We have the 50mm 1.0 and the 50mm f2 that are weather sealed, so the biggest and smallest lens. There's no optical stabilization and there's also no buttons or switches, so there's only an aperture ring and a focus ring. So let's have a look now at each of them individually. The 50mm f1.0 obviously is the biggest lens here, it's also the heaviest. I find the handling on the X-T4 to be okay, but you definitely feel the weight of the lens. It has a smooth aperture ring and it's not too noisy either. And the focus ring feels good as well when turned. The 56mm 1.2 has a very good size, it balances very well on many Fujifilm cameras, smaller and bigger ones. The aperture ring is a bit more freely, you can turn it more easily without paying attention. The focus ring, however, feels good when turned. Now the 50mm f2 has the most precise aperture ring in my opinion. You really feel the 1/3 steps as you turn it, it's not too smooth, not too resistant, not too hard either. And the focus ring is also really good. Then we have the Viltrox, and what's interesting about the Viltrox is that it has a clickless aperture ring, so when you turn the aperture ring you don't feel the 1/3 steps. However, when you use the lens on the camera with the camera turned on, as you can see, you actually see the 1/3 steps increase or decrease when you change the aperture. So it's not really clickless in the sense that it doesn't give you a smooth transition between each aperture value. I'm not sure why they actually made it clickless, because it doesn't fulfill the entire advantage of having a clickless aperture ring. Then we have the focus ring, and the focus ring, it's the one that feels the less smooth. I mean, when you turn it, sometimes it is smooth, but then it hardens a little bit and then it's smooth again. So it's not very constant when it comes to the whole rotation. And another thing about the Viltrox is that it malfunctioned a couple of times. The screen starts to go black. The only thing to do at this point is to turn off the camera and mount the lens again and make sure it's really tight when you mount it, and then turn the camera on and it should be fine. So we have two 50mm and two 56mm, different fastest aperture for all of them, so let's start to talk about that. Here we have the aperture values between each full increment, each full stop of exposure. So for example, 1.0 is 1 stop faster than 1.4 and so on. 1.2 is approximately half a stop between 1.0 and 1.4. Then we have the difference between 50mm and 56mm, as you can see here with this portrait example and here with this landscape image. Then we have the focal length, the equivalent focal length in full frame terms, and the angle of view for each lens. These numbers come from the official website of each brand. Each lens is different when it comes to the minimum focus distance. Here is how close the 50mm f1 can get. Then we have the 56mm 1.2, the Viltrox 56mm 1.4, and finally the 50mm f2, which is the one with the shortest focus distance. Right, let's talk about sharpness, but first of all, a couple of points. I'm not going to show you every single image for every single aperture on every single lens, because otherwise the video is going to become too long. So if you want to see the entire sharpness test, I'll leave the link of the article on our website mirrorlesscomparison.com, where you can find everything. And to make my commentary easy to hear for you guys, I decided to give a nickname to each lens. The 50mm f1.0 is called the Big 50. The 56mm 1.2 is just the 56. The Viltrox can stay the Viltrox, and the 50 f2 becomes the tiny 50. Let's get started. So my first test was taken with a focus distance of approximately 3.5 meters, which is the distance more or less you need to frame a half a body person with these lenses. The first sample showed the result at each lens fastest aperture, so obviously we have different apertures. The 56 is the sharpest, followed by the big 50 and the tiny 50, and the Viltrox is a bit softer and has a bit less contrast. At 1.4, the big 50 is very close to the 56. The difference with the Viltrox becomes more noticeable. At f2, the big 50 and the 56 are razor sharp at this point, but the Viltrox is the real surprise as it gets on the same level as the two more expensive Fujifilm lenses. The tiny 50 is less crisp, although the difference is not huge. At f2.8, they are all on the same level. At f4, the Viltrox remains to a similar level as the big 50 and 56. The tiny 50 is a bit behind. My second test was taken with a much longer focus distance, not too far from infinity. The results are very similar to my previous test, and they all peak at f2.8. At f4, the tiny 50 is a bit softer than the other lenses. From 5.6, the big 50 and 56 remain sharper throughout the smaller apertures, where at that point they all show a bit of diffraction. This second test is also good to evaluate sharpness in the corners to see how well these lenses can perform for other genres such as landscape and architecture. The 56 is the sharpest at the fastest aperture, followed by the tiny 50. The other two lenses are visibly softer and the Viltrox is the worst. At 1.4, the big 50 improves, but the 56 remains the sharpest. At f2, the big 50 and tiny 50 are on the same level. The Viltrox improves but remains softer than the other lenses. From 2.8, they all start to show optimal results. The big 50 and the 56 remain ahead of the other two lenses even with smaller apertures. The Viltrox gradually improves until f8. Finally, our sharpness test concludes with the minimum focus distance. At the fastest apertures, the tiny 50 is not only the lens that can get closer, but is also the sharpest. The big 50 and the 56 are a bit soft and the Viltrox has the worst performance. At 1.4, the big 50 improves a little whereas the 56 remains similar. At f2, the three Fujifilm lenses improve, the big 50 and the tiny 50 are on the same level, the 56 is slightly softer and the Viltrox is last. At 2.8, the tiny 50 remains on top, the big 50 and 56 are on the same level and the Viltrox improves considerably. At f4, all four lenses are on a similar level and that is where they peak. We're finally done with the sharpness test, so now let's see some portrait example, and we're also going to talk about the bokeh, the quality of the autofocus areas and all this kind of stuff. Here we are indoor with a background relatively close to the subject. The big 50 is the lens that gives you the shallowest depth of field thanks to the f1.0 aperture. The 56 does a good job, but the extra 6mm doesn't really help here, and overall the big 50 has a smoother bokeh. It is also interesting to note that the combination of faster aperture and wider angle of view of the big 50 gives more subject separation. It's not a drastic difference, but I think this example shows one of the strengths of the big 50 when used indoor where space to move around can be limited. The Viltrox defends itself well, but the bokeh is a bit less smooth than the other two lenses. The tiny 50 obviously suffers more the comparison because of the slower aperture and the background is more distracting. At 1.4, the 56 doesn't change much, whereas the difference between 1.0 and 1.4 with the big 50 is more relevant, so now these two lenses look more similar when stopped down at f1.4. It is interesting to see how much of a difference there is with the big 50 and the tiny 50 at f2. The bokeh of the big 50 is much smoother. Out of curiosity, I took two images with the big 50 and 56, both set at f1.4 and matched the same composition, so using a different camera to subject distance to counterbalance the different focal length. The big 50 gives a bit more shallow depth of field thanks to the shorter focus distance. Concerning the autofocus rendering, or bokeh, allow me to share a few extra notes. For each lens at the fastest aperture, there are oval shapes at the edges. The ones on the big 50 have the distinctive cat's eye look, whereas the other have a less precise form. At the center, the big 50 has rounded circles that are plain and smooth. The 56 has more onion rings and brighter edges. The Viltrox bokeh balls have less onion rings, but the circular shape is not perfect. The tiny 50 has a bit of onion rings and irregular form too, and it also displays a bit of color fringe at the borders. At f1.4, the big 50 bokeh circles are more rounded at the center and the oval shapes at the edges are less apparent. The 56 displays the same results than at f1.2. From f2, they start to display the iris shape and lose the circular shape. Right, let me take a break from talking and show you some extra sample images, this time taken outside, and all the comments I've made when it comes to bokeh, the quality of the autofocus, and the depth of field are also valid for those as well. By usual suspects, I mean all the other basic tests that one does when it comes to lens reviews, so chromatic aberration, vignetting, flare, etc. And I'll try to be as quick as possible. The big 50 displays a lot of vignetting at the fastest aperture, which is not surprising. It improves at 1.4 and it's mostly gone by 2.8. The 56 has a lot of it at 1.2 and 1.4. It improves at f2.0 and is mostly gone by f4. The Viltrox has less vignetting at the fastest aperture, but you have to close down to f4 to see it completely gone. The tiny 50 has little vignetting at f2 and it's almost completely gone at 2.8 already. It's also worth mentioning that vignetting can be easily removed in post with a raw file. The big 50 shows chromatic aberration at 1.0 and 1.4. It is less severe from f2. You will need a bit of manual correction in post to get rid of it. We have similar results for the 56 and it actually displays a bit more chromatic aberration at f2. The Viltrox is the lens that suffers more from chromatic aberration wide open. I didn't even need to do a separate test because it was evident with other shots like one of my sharpness tests. It improves at f2 and it's gone by 2.8. The tiny 50 is the one that suffers less from it. There is almost nothing at f2 and nothing at all from 2.8. Each lens can display ghost flares and a bit of rainbow flare with direct light, which can be more or less invasive depending on the intensity of that light. The big 50 shows a little bit of barrel distortion and so does the 56, but it's really small. The Viltrox has a more apparent pincushion distortion. The tiny 50 doesn't have any visible distortion at all. Let's have a look at the autofocus performance, both when it comes to the AF speed as well as the use of face and eye detection. Here the tiny 50 is the fastest. You can see how quick it goes from one focus distance to the other without hesitation. The Viltrox is the second fastest, actually not far from the tiny 50 surprisingly. Then we have the big 50 and 56, which are slower, and you can see the change in focus being a bit more hesitant at times. If the subject is not moving, face and eye detection on the X-T4 at least is reliable. All the portrait examples I show you in the video were taken with eye detection. The only thing I would advise is don't take just one picture, take at least 2 or 3. This is what I did because sometimes one of these 3 images might be slightly off, slightly soft in comparison to the other 2. So face and eye detection is reliable, but don't trust it 100%. Then I did a simple walk-in test for still and video. For still, I counted the amount of shots in focus and those out of focus. The big 50 gave me only 1 shot in focus out of 15 when set to the fastest aperture of 1.0. That is partially because the lens AF motor is not super fast, but also because at 1.0 the depth of field is so shallow that any slight movement of the subject makes you lose details, and obviously the camera and the lens are not fast enough, not precise enough in tracking the subject. At f2 it's much better with a 53% keeper rate. The 56 gave me a 44% hit rate at 1.2 and a 67% result at 2.0. The Viltrox had a keeper rate of 47% at 1.4 and not less than 80% when stopped down at f2. And finally, the tiny 50 is the best with a keeper rate of over 80%. A little explanation about the difference in number of shots taken. I set the camera to focus priority and 5 frames per second of continuous shooting. Focus priority means that the shot is taken only when focus is achieved. So the reason why the X-T4 took less shots with the big 50 or the 56 is because it took more time to correct focus while the subject was moving, and therefore it took less images. This is another indication of the slowest performance of these 2 lenses. Now I'm going to show you some sample videos, sample footage I shot in 4K with X-T4. And what you'll notice with all these lenses is that there is a tendency of going back and forth at some point while the subject is closing to the camera. At some point the camera goes back to the background and comes back to the foreground. The only lens that didn't give me this was the big 50, surprisingly. And then there's a second test where the subject suddenly appears in the frame, so triggering a fast change of focus point. And some lenses are faster than others, but none of these 4 lenses managed to do a fast and smooth transition from one point to the other. They all go by steps. One note about the Viltrox. On the official website there is a table you can consult to see the compatibility with all the Fujifilm camera models, as well as the firmware version needed. However, some cameras are not entirely compatible, and I've reported those in the slide you're seeing right now. I've mentioned the focus ring before at the beginning of the video, but all these lenses have a fly-by-wire focus ring, and that means that when you turn the ring you're not moving the lens element inside the lens directly. It actually sends a signal back to the camera, and then the camera instructs the lens to move these lens elements back and forth. So when you turn the ring with the camera turned off, you may feel that one ring is better than the others, but what really counts is to see how the electronic communication of this ring works once the camera is on. I could see this while doing my sharpness test, and what I found is that actually the Viltrox and the Tiny 50 are the ones that gives you the easiest and most precise manual focus experience, which is a bit weird because the Viltrox ring is not smooth by itself, but when you actually work with the camera, it's okay. And the Tiny 50 is definitely the most precise. The 56 is the most frustrating because when you turn the focus ring, the change in focus distance goes by step. It's not smooth. It jumps from one point to the other. So to really fine-tune sharpness where you want it, you have to keep going back and forth. It's a bit more time-consuming. The big 50 is a bit like that as well, but it's not as bad as the 56. Then I just want to add something here because I encountered a singular problem with these lenses and the X-T4 when working manual focus. So usually you set the camera to manual focus, you use focus magnification or any other MF assist to fine-tune the focus point where you want, and then you take the picture. What happens with the X-T4 is that when I take the picture, the camera often moves the lens elements back and forth. And sometimes by doing that, it actually changes your focus point. At the beginning, I couldn't get my head around this. Said why it changes the focus when the camera is in manual focus mode. I mean, every other system I've used and worked with, that never happens. With the X-T4, I actually had to find a workaround, which was to remain in single AF mode and then activate the AF plus MF option. And basically what that does is that once you have pressed the shutter button, the camera focuses automatically, but then allows you to fine tune the focus manually. And so by doing that, when I then fully press the shutter button, the camera didn't refocus. But it was quite annoying, and I think it's a bug, something that hopefully Fujifilm can fix with a firmware update, because there is no reason for the camera to move the lens elements after you set your focus point manually and when you are in manual focus. Now, this happened especially with the 56, a couple of times with the big 50 as well, whereas with the tiny 50 and the Viltrox, that happened much less. And by the way, if you also use a Fujifilm camera in manual focus and encounter the same thing, just let me know, because I'm just curious to understand if this is just a problem with my setup or other people have encountered the same. Right, final verdict on these 4 lenses. So let's start with the big 50 f1.0. I think this is a very surprising and very impressive lens overall. If you think that number 1 is the first autofocus lens with such a bright aperture of 1.0, and from the fastest aperture it already shows excellent sharpness. It has the smoothest bokeh of all the lenses I've tested, and this combination of slightly shorter focal length and shallowest depth of field, I think in some situations it actually makes a difference. I think if you're an avid portrait photographer or do portraits for a living, you can find in this lens some added benefits to your work. Of course, it's big, it's heavy, it's expensive, but if you are one camera, one lens kind of person, I think you won't find this lens too bad when it comes to the size. And also, it is expensive, but I don't find it to be too expensive if you think about some other lenses you can find for other systems. If you want the best, the fastest portrait lens for Sony, for Canon, you're going to spend more money. So I think they gave this lens a fair price overall. Then we have the 56 1.2. So the 56, it's the oldest, so it has a bit more quirks when it comes to the design and the precision of its aperture and focus ring, especially in manual focus, is a bit of a nightmare with this lens. But it's much smaller. Number 1, it's actually a very nice size for most Fuji cameras, and it's very sharp right from 1.2. So I think, and of course it's less expensive, I think overall for many people this will still remain the number 1 choice. Then we have the, actually let me talk about the tiny 50 first. And I personally really like this lens for a few reasons. Number 1, you can almost fit it in your jeans pocket, or you can easily fit in a jacket's pocket. It's very good when it comes to autofocus. It's actually the fastest lens in this comparison. And if you like close-ups, if you like to get close to your subject to capture some details, this is actually the best lens. Not only because it has a shorter focus, a minimum focus distance, but it also gives you sharpest images at the minimum focus distance of all the other lenses. So it still has a few things that are unique. And also another thing to consider, if you use an X Pro 1, X Pro 2, X Pro 3, with the optical viewfinder, this lens won't get too much in the way of the optical viewfinder, so another point to consider. And then we have the Viltrox. And I'll be honest with you, I bought this lens just for this comparison, but I didn't have any expectation. I had the 3 other lenses and I thought, why not just add a 4th lens, since many people are talking about this brand right now, to see how it performs. Also because Viltrox, at the time of publishing this video, is the only third-party manufacturer that is making autofocus lenses for Fuji. And I have to say, it's probably the lens that surprised me the most in this comparison. Yes, at 1.4, it's a bit soft. It's not bad, but it's not great either. But once you step down to f2, it really becomes sharp and would say on the same level most of the time with the other lenses. And the other thing that surprised me is the autofocus, because as far as I know, Fujifilm hasn't disclosed the specs of its X mount to third-party developers. like for example Sony did with the A-mount. I know that Fujifilm is considering doing so, but if I understand correctly, as of now, Viltrox has to do reverse engineering to design the autofocus part. And I wasn't expecting the lens to be as good in my test. Most of the time it almost matched the same performance as the Tiny 50, the 50 f2. And obviously it's the least expensive, it's the cheapest lens. So I think if you're a beginner or you just don't want to spend a lot of money because you won't take portrait every day, I think this lens has a strong case for itself. Right, so this is the end for real this time. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like and subscribe to our channel. If you have any question, as usual, leave a comment and I'll answer as soon as I can, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.